"I'll leave at dawn," said the rejected mail order. "Bride," the rancher barred the door. "Not alone." The wind howled like a wounded animal across the frozen plains, rattling the loose boards of the ranch house as Eliza Moore stood on the porch, her gloved fingers trembling around a creased letter that had carried her halfway across the country and into a life she no longer recognized. Snow clung to the hem of her faded burgundy dress, the fabric stiff with cold, while two small children pressed against her skirts, as if she were the last warm thing left in the world. Behind her, the door to the ranch house stood closed, barred from the inside, and the man who was supposed to be her future had chosen silence over welcome. Just hours earlier, she had arrived by wagon, heart pounding with fragile hope, believing the words he had written, that he wanted a wife, a home, a family. But when Jonah Blackwood finally opened the door and saw her, his eyes had hardened not with cruelty, but with something worse, fear and resistance. He had looked past her to the children and said flatly that he had not agreed to that. The letter had not mentioned them. Eliza had tried to explain, her voice shaking as she told him they were her late sister's children, left orphaned by fever, that she could not abandon them. Jonah's jaw had tightened, and after a long silence that felt like judgment itself, he had stepped back inside and barred the door, saying only that he needed time, that this was not what he had agreed to. Now the daylight was fading, the cold deepening, and Eliza felt the weight of her choices pressing down harder than the snow clouds overhead. She knelt to the children, smoothing their hair, whispering promises she prayed she could keep, and when she rose again, her spine straightened with quiet resolve. She knocked once more, not in desperation but in dignity, and when there was no answer, she spoke clearly into the night, her voice carrying through the crack under the door. "I'll leave at dawn," she said. "You won't have to worry about us anymore." Inside, Jonah leaned against the wall, his heart pounding louder than the wind outside. He had not expected children. He had buried his wife and infant son 3 winters ago, and the grief had carved a hollow place in him he had sworn never to fill again. He wanted a practical arrangement, not more mouths to feed, not memories that might reopen scars he had barely survived. Yet as Eliza's words echoed, images rose unbidden, her tired eyes that still held kindness, the way the children clung to her with unquestioning trust, the strength it must have taken for a herd across mountains and plains, with nothing but hope and responsibility. Jonah slid down to the floor, burying his face in his hands, wrestling with fear disguised as anger. Outside, Eliza gathered the children and retreated to the small barn, laying out what little bedding she had brought, holding them close as night fell. She told them stories by whisper, tales of brave people who faced the dark and lived to see morning, even as doubt gnawed at her own heart. Sleep came fitfully, broken by the creak of wood and the whistle of wind. In the ranch house, Jonah did not sleep at all. He paced, remembered, argued with himself, telling himself it was not his responsibility, that he had been deceived, that turning them away was reasonable. But reason felt thin against the ache growing in his chest. Before dawn, he finally stopped pacing and stared at the barred door, the memory of Eliza's steady voice replaying in his mind. "I'll leave at dawn." The word sounded less like a threat and more like a farewell he might regret forever. And as the first pale light crept across the snow, Jonah made a decision that would change all of their lives, though he did not yet know how deep the change would go. If this story is already pulling at your heart, remember to subscribe to the channel now, because what happens next will remind you that sometimes the bravest choices are the ones we make when it's almost too late. Dawn broke softly, painting the frozen land in pale gold, and Eliza rose before the children stirred, her body aching from the cold but her spirit oddly calm, as if clarity had finally replaced fear. She packed their few belongings with careful hands, every movement deliberate, unwilling to let despair rush her. When the children woke, she smiled as if this were just another journey, telling them they were strong, that they would find a place where they were wanted. She did not look back at the ranch house as they stepped onto the snow-covered yard, because she knew if she did, her resolve might crack. Inside, Jonah stood at the window, watching them prepare to leave, his chest tightening with every step they took away from the door. The sight of the smallest child, struggling to lift a bundle, broke something open in him, something he had kept sealed since grief first taught him how to shut his heart. Before he could talk himself out of it, he grabbed his coat and flung the door open, the sound sharp in the quiet morning. Eliza froze, turning slowly, bracing herself for final rejection. But Jonah's voice came rough and urgent. "You're not leaving," he said, stepping toward them. Confusion flickered across her face, quickly followed by guarded disbelief. "I said I'd go at dawn," she replied softly. Jonah shook his head. "Not alone," he said. He knelt in the snow in front of the children, meeting their eyes, feeling the sting of cold seep through his knees as if it were penance. He told Eliza the truth then about his wife, his son, the fear that had ruled him since their graves filled with snow. He admitted he had been wrong to bar the door, wrong to let his past decide their future. Eliza listened, tears freezing on her lashes. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had finally been acknowledged. She did not rush to forgive. Instead, she spoke of her own losses, of the sister she had buried, of promises made at a deathbed, of how love sometimes came wrapped in responsibility rather than romance. Standing there in the cold, they made no grand declarations, only a quiet agreement to try, to face uncertainty together rather than alone. Jonah unbarred the door fully then, holding it open as Eliza led the children inside, warmth rushing over them like mercy. Days turned into weeks and the ranch slowly changed. Laughter returned to rooms that had known only silence. Jonah learned that strength did not mean never hurting, but choosing to care even when pain was possible. Eliza learned that home was not a place without conflict, but one where people stayed to work through it. Trust grew in small acts, shared meals, mended fences, bedtime stories told by a man who had sworn never to love children again. When spring finally came, melting the snow and softening the land, Jonah asked Eliza to stay not out of obligation, but out of choice. And she said yes, not because the past was forgotten, but because the future felt worth believing in. Their story spread through the valley, not as a tale of perfection, but as proof that courage often begins after rejection, and love sometimes arrives disguised as a second chance. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you that hope can survive even the coldest nights, make sure you subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because more powerful stories like this, stories of resilience, faith, and unexpected love, are waiting for you.